Well, greetings everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I've been propelled forward because our online speaker has been delayed, so I hope I can, as it were, make up for the lost time. The topic I want to address is not natural law as an academic pursuit or as an intellectual philosophical notion per se. I want to look at natural law as a way of communicating in the public square, and in particular, as a way of communicating to people who may not agree with us about natural law norms. Natural law as addressing, if you like, the world elites, people in power. How are we going to address them? Well, I'm going to outline very briefly two ways I think aren't going to work, and I'm going to suggest my own way, which I think will work, or if it doesn't work, it has a better chance of being persuasive. So, the first way that I think we shouldn't go is what I want to call a thick way or a too thick way. A metaphysically very heavy way, which invokes theistic metaphysics, talks about the natural law as participating in the eternal law, the divine law, and the whole superstructure, if you like, of natural law thought in Aquinas and others. Now, of course, we know that Aquinas talks about knowledge of God as one of the key goods to which we're directed. Now, that may all be true, and I may well be sympathetic to that, but it's not relevant to addressing people in the public square. I think that if we go down that route, it will immediately alienate most of our audience. So bracket theistic metaphysics. As David Oderberg has argued, the grasp, the epistemic grasp of natural law norms can take place without any of that metaphysical background. So that's one thing. Heavy, thick metaphysics is not necessary. Another thing is terminological. So we should avoid arcane, complex terminology. If you read people like Edward Fazer, they're very interesting on the natural law, but they tend to invoke concepts like active and passive powers. They tend to talk about even inanimate objects having a teleology. That is, rocks have a teleology of some kind. Now, that might be true, but it's not going to help us communicate with people. So that heavy scholastic terminology, I think, has to be dropped. It's not helpful. So that's the thick, as it were, avenue. The thin avenue, and this is going to upset a lot of people, is the route of new natural law. New natural law, which goes back to John Finnis and Germain Grise, is a very interesting project. And I think that it's done a lot of good in jurisprudence. But as a mode of communication in the public square, it's very thin. It's very thin precisely because it tries to do completely without metaphysics and completely without any ontological reference. Its methodology is highly a prioristic and I think stipulative, therefore. That is, it makes assertions about what the basic goods of life are, but it doesn't attempt to justify them because it says that that's not possible. For those of you who know the literature, they say that those goods are per se nota, that is, they are self-evident. Right? So that, as it were, the basis of their theory is something which they're not willing to unpack. They're not willing to give a rich account of. And I think that's unfortunate. It's deliberately to cut off the basis, the persuasive ground of one's own theory. So I think that's one among many ways in which the theory is thin. There's no systematization of the basic goods. There's no hierarchy between the basic goods. And there's no guidance on comparing goods because they're viewed as incommensurable. On all those grounds, I think that if we want to speak persuasively and richly to people in the public square, then the new natural law approach is very wanting. It's too thin. So where do we go? Well, being a philosopher, my answer is philosophical in part, but not in whole. At the level of metaphysics, I think the theory of perfectionism is the way to go. What is perfectionism? Well, it's a mainstream analytic philosophical theory which holds that human goods are perfections of the human person. That is, that goods complete our nature. They are that which our nature is directed towards, and they fulfill, therefore, our nature as human beings. So it takes very seriously the idea of a human nature, and it takes very seriously the idea that our nature is teleological. That is, it's directed towards certain ends. As the Vice-Chancellor was suggesting, that's an idea that's very unpopular in the public square, but it's one that we have to stand up for. It's one that we have to persuade people is true. Perfectionism allows us to do that. What's good about perfectionism as well is that it avoids scholastic terminology. It's much more a mainstream analytic theory, and it avoids the thinness of new natural law because it allows discussion of the basic goods toward which we're directed. Indeed, it gives a very rich account in some cases. So just to name some people in analytic perfectionism, people like Tom Herker in Canada, David Brink in the United States, and Gwen Bradford in the United States. These are secular thinkers who are nonetheless perfectionists. So we can dialogue with them, we can dialogue on that basis, I think, much more successfully. So that's, as it were, the positive account of a way to go metaphysically. But we also have to engage, I think, in what you might call bread and butter way. And this is something we're not very good at doing as natural lawyers. We have to engage with empirical science. We have to be much more willing to study, to investigate psychology, sociology, disciplines like biology. These are all vital, it seems to me, for engaging people in the public square. It's not always easy to engage with for people who are not experts in them, but we can, as it were, mine those disciplines for arguments, conclusions, which, as it were, dovetail with our own views metaphysically. Now, it used to be the case that I think literature would be a very good way of appealing to people. After all, literature is much older than some of those disciplines like sociology or psychology. The trouble is that literature is always going to be parochial in the sense that it's confined to a particular tradition. So English literature, Spanish literature, these are largely literatures which are unknown to people who inhabit a different language. So there is a drawback to using literary sources. And I think the empirical sciences allow us to overcome that drawback because they appeal transculturally across cultures. give you some examples. I'll use some examples from the sphere of the family, which is probably one of the most important spheres for us. There's mounting evidence, empirical evidence, for the damage to the family that there is to children in particular, and also to women, from having no father in the home. We know that. It's been mounting for decades now. The empirical science is very clear that the costs of having no father in the home are severe. We can make that argument, we can produce evidence for it, which I think is conclusive evidence. If there's no father in the home, the family is going to suffer. It's going to be financially much worse off. It's going to be psychologically much more vulnerable. It's going to be emotionally much more chaotic. Of course, not any father in the home will do. A father who observes a set of natural law norms will do, right? So it's not just the father, but that's a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. Another example, divorce. So Vice Chancellor was saying there's a kind of libertarian movement afoot that says that divorce is just to break a contract, as it were, a mutually agreed contract, and people are free to do that, just like they can break a normal contract. Perhaps they have to pay certain minimal price for doing so, but that's just, as it were, by the by. There's nothing sacred, there's nothing, as it were, deep about breaking a marriage. It's just to break a contract, and you can do that unilaterally without any real consequences, right? We know that's not true. We know from the empirical scientific literature that that's false, that if you break the marriage contract, the consequences are much worse, and particularly for children. Right? So one of the things I want to say is that natural law should highlight the condition of certain people over others, particularly the condition of children. Because it seems to me that the condition of children has been the one to suffer most from the growing libertarianism we see in mainstream society. They are the most vulnerable agents, arguably, and they're the ones who have no say over the law. They have no democratic voice at all. They need people to speak up for them. And as natural law theorists, I think we should be doing that. Not just children, of course, also the very old are vulnerable. And that brings me to another issue, a very topical issue in many countries, that of euthanasia. So euthanasia is being sold, if you like. It's being advocated as a great mercy, as a great act of compassion towards those who are suffering. But I think that the empirical evidence will bear out over the next coming decades that that is false, that that is a lie, that euthanasia is a way that mainstream society has of dealing with people who are no longer of interest to it, people who are not productive in the economy, and people who have or who represent a burden on healthcare systems. And euthanasia is a great boon to governments who want to save money. It's a great boon to families who don't want to bother to look after their relatives, who want to have done with them. And I think the empirical science literature will bear this out over the next coming decades. It's in its infancy. We know there's substantial evidence from Holland and Belgium already along this dimension, but it's mounting across the world. So again, another way in which the vulnerable, the genuinely weak, the genuinely powerless are being targeted by this new libertarianism. We can draw on the empirical science to demonstrate that. Now, to finish up, what can we do practically as natural law advocates, if you like? Well, I think our position, if you like, our platform faces an immense challenge, right? All the main bodies, from NGOs to governments, to media, to universities, are hostile to many of the things that I've said. So we have to have courage, and I think we have to develop solidarity with other traditional groups, if you like. It seems to me that there's a tendency to think that our enemies, if you like, are other people in traditional communities, right? It seems to me that's not true. We have to build bridges with other traditional communities in Africa and elsewhere, right? Across religious divides, yes, there are those divides, but we have much more in common with those other traditional communities than we have with people in positions of power. In general, not always the case, but in general, that's the case. Because Ubuntu and other community-minded ethics are present in traditional communities in the way in which they're not in the opinion-forming classes. The opinion-forming classes are not very interested in community. They're not very interested in what it takes to form a community and sustain a community. That is the self-discipline, the commitment over time, the commitment to sustaining a family. What that takes is actually a lot of effort, a lot of heartache, a lot of self-denial. And that's something the opinion-forming classes don't want to hear. Because also, as the Vice-Chancellor said, they don't want to tell people what to do. They're much more at ease when it's about liberating the individual. But when what I've suggested, or tried to suggest, is that what's being liberated is not the individual as such, but the robust adult individual. Children, the very old, the disabled, they're individuals as well, but they're not being liberated. They're being sold down the river by this new ethic. They're being oppressed by this new ethic. So the liberatory narrative, seems to me, is very narrow in its focus. It's actually liberating one class of person, the adult, robust individual who has no disabilities and is not vulnerable like the very young or the very old. So one task, I think, for us as natural law proponents is that we have to uncover, we have to expose that narrative of liberation and say it's not genuine liberation, it's a pseudo-liberation. It's a pretended liberation. Okay. I've gone on till almost 3:30. So perhaps time for questions? Yep.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. A lot of, you really explained very much some of the things I give some bare bones to. And you said you're very practical about it. You want to take a very practical approach to this. What would be the first steps in building an Ubuntu paradigm? What what do you foresee as the steps ahead, and what are the first steps people should take in order to construct an Ubuntu philosophy by which we can be guided?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think there's no one answer to that. It depends what position you occupy, right? Your positionality, as they say these days. So for someone like me who works at the academic level, it will be working at a rather abstract level, arguing for certain metaphysical claims and certain structures and norms. For somebody at a more communal level, say a health worker or someone working in a school, whatever, it's about trying to implement, trying to safeguard some of the norms that we hold dear. It's really a question of where you find yourself. And of course, that will apply also at the economic level, at the level of business culture, at the political level. At every level of society, we've got something to say. It seems to me that this, what I've called libertarianism, is very much at work also at the economic level. And that too has to be questioned, has to be curtailed in some ways for a society to flourish. So the answer is nuanced. Yeah. Yeah. I hope that helps. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tom, for your great presentation. I just want to ask you a little more development on the midway between the thick and the new one, or finish the new natural school movement. That for me is quite interesting, no? The new approaches to natural law and how we can do better here, no?
Yeah, well, what I've said on that front is programmatic. That is, it's a work in progress. And as usual with academics, I'm tooting my own horn because that's the that's the direction I'm going in. So, but the reason I've gone that direction is because I think there's a felt need to go in that direction. It's amazing how parochial, if you like, a lot of the work in natural law is. That is, it speaks to a clique. It speaks to either an academic clique or another kind of clique, but it doesn't speak beyond those cliques. And I think that we need to look beyond these horizons and use a language and a methodology which has the chance of actually working. Now, I know that academics often don't like that pragmatism. They think it comes at the cost of genuine or integral, if you like, research. But the title of my talk was "The Prospects for Natural Law in the 20th Century in the Public Square," right? That's as it were, what I wanted to talk about. Because if we don't have any influence in the public square, what are we bothering for, right? It seems to me that if there's any area in ethical theory that needs to talk beyond the academy, it's this one, right? We have the resources to do so. We have the call to do so. We're under an obligation to do so, it seems to me. That might not be the case for certain academic ethical theories. Indeed, many people in academia seem perfectly at home with the idea that their theories will have no bearing on how life is lived. Right? Well, but fine. Then it becomes an academic parlor game. And you can make, have a very happy life doing that. It seems to me we have to have a purchase in the real world. That's been the concern of my talk.
I would first like to thank you for your last comment. It is important that we make natural law and its principles accessible to people in the public square. There's a question from Callum Scott. He joined us online. The question says, of course, secularism is rising in Africa. But if one considers that, say, bearing in mind that you packed metaphysics at the beginning, atheism on the whole is not widely expressed across Africa. He also says, a consideration, are the enemies of natural law not perhaps extant outside of Africa to a paradigm that is rather Western and secularist? That's what Callum Scott says. So he brings up the enemies of natural law being outside of Africa to a paradigm that is Western and secularist. And he also says that atheism on a whole is not widely expressed across Africa. So he says that, you know, the things that you talked about in your talk may not really be very, you know, pertinent in Africa.
Yeah,
thank you.
But that's a sharp question. Is it relevant to Africa? I would say manifestly. Why? Because Africa doesn't exist on its own. Africa is subject to massive forces, institutional forces that are not of its own making. And that has always been the case, right? Going back for centuries. It seems to me that the dominant voices are still outside Africa, right? And that's a shame in many ways, because it's my view that we have a lot more to offer the world, you know? But we are subject to a lot of constraints not of our own making. And we have to have a story to tell and to try and resist those constraints and try and give a narrative which is not just our own, but shared with people across the world, but it is not a dominant narrative, not a dominant voice, okay? So it seems to me, in a nutshell, that what Africa has to offer is actually much more continuous with how, say, Europe and the United States were about 50 years ago, right? It's Europe and the United States which are the dominant voices still, and they have shifted dramatically in many ways. And I think that we have to make common cause with people who have not been part of that libertarian change, okay? Because I think we know in Africa that the costs are very high, right? So it's not about being African or not being African. It's about making common cause with people with whom we agree, okay? And there are many people outside Africa with whom we agree. Indeed, if we don't do that, then I think we're just going to be swamped. I'll give you one example before shutting up, which is that in South Africa, where I live and teach, much of the vocabulary, much of the political rhetoric is not indigenous. It's not coming from South Africa. It's coming from the United States, right? Even though it has no relevance or very little relevance to our lives, a lot of the terminology, a lot of the rhetoric is foreign. And nonetheless, it has dominance. Nonetheless, it has huge power over us. So I want to say that we have to develop our own as it were, mode of resistance to that, not just through being African, but by making common cause with people throughout the world. Okay, thanks.
So I have a question, and you propose, you propose the metaphysical way to which you intend to go through your scholarly undertakings, and for this you talk about perfectionism and how exactly it avoids thinness in terms of scholarly works. So I am just curious. You mentioned, for example, Dave Brick in the US, and how from your research, what percentage of of scholars or people in academia are using this approach that you and
What percentage?
will you classify it
dear.
as being dominant?
What's the market uptake?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh dear. Got a good story. It's a minority view. It's a minority view. I would say the vast majority of moral philosophers in the Anglophone world are consequentialists or deontologists, some variety of Rawlsian or Kantian. Now that's the dominant two schools, right? And there's a kind of constant bickering that goes on between them. And that's all well and good. But perfectionism, I think, is a much more promising way to go. Its lack of dominance, its minority voice, is owing to a general societal fact, right? Which is continuous with the kind of problem that we face in the public square. So the academy, the lack of voice that we have in the public square is mirrored in the academy, right? And at the level of theory. If you look at the public square, the kind of reasoning you tend to get is consequentialist or deontological, right? Actually much more consequentialist usually. You could view deontology as a kind of academic rearguard action, which never really works. So the majority of people in the public square are consequentialists. That's the problem, right? It's not something we just take lying down. It's not something that we just say, oh, well, that's how the world works. Right? No, you stand up to it. You say, no, you shouldn't be a consequentialist. It's not that consequences don't matter. Consequences do matter, but that's different from being a consequentialist, which is that the only thing that matter are consequences, right? And that's a very pernicious view. So we've got to have the courage of our convictions. It's always been the case that the truth struggles in the world, right? The good struggles to make itself heard, right? It's not a reason to give up. It's a reason to persevere. So I think that's the position we're in. Things have become more difficult over the last 20 years since the millennium for people holding these kinds of positions. But we don't give up. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation, Professor Angier. You spoke about developing solidarity with traditional groups. And the thing I understand on this word is that natural law is considered to be above of the Ubuntu concept in terms of reputation, if I can say. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you.
So the question is about Ubuntu and how it relates to natural law? Or can you specify a bit?
I just wanted some more details or some more explanation about the thing you said about that we have to develop solidarity with traditional communities.
Yes, that's right. Well, I say that because it seems to me that there are a lot of voices out there which think that that kind of solidarity is basically impossible, okay? Because there are some fringe groups out there who are very dangerous, right? So take jihadi groups, for instance, right? They're clearly a great danger to communal life. And they're taken as paradigmatic somehow. And so he said, well, we can't deal with them. So we sort of retreat to our own community, right? But that covers up the fact that in Islam, there are many, many communities we can communicate with and we can get on with and we can have a common voice with, okay? Those are the people we need to be talking to a lot more. Those are the people we share a lot with. Therefore, I think we can be a voice for saying to countries like France and Belgium and Quebec and other places, no, you shouldn't be banning face veils. right? That goes against natural law. There's things like that, right? So we can build bridges with many communities, either Muslim or traditional African and beyond, okay? And it seems to me we share as a lot more with them in general, than we do with the opinion forming classes, okay? The people who shape policy, the people who shape the economic sphere even.
Okay, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you, Professor Tom, for the presentation.
Thank you so much.